and thank you to everyone who has joined or is joining. I'm super excited and super pleased to welcome once again on campus, this time virtually, Mr. David Hobbs. And David, I have to say you are a very good friend of University of Leeds now, because I remember the first time we met, it wasn't in Leeds or UK, it was in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly headquarters, which is in Brussels in Belgium. And I remember we took some students to European Parliament, and because of our alumni link, who has been working for the NATO PA for some time, she has very kindly organized a session to learn about NATO PA, and we went to the headquarters, we went to a lovely room upstairs, beautiful building in the city center of Brussels, and we have been told that for 5 minutes, this very high profile person, Secretary General, will come and do a quick introduction. And what was meant to be a quick introduction was actually hour-and-a-half session where our students had amazing insight into your life and into your work as NATO PA Secretary General. And blimey, we discussed everything and anything, ranging from North Korea, South Korea, to Donald Trump, to all sorts of security issues and what NATO has been involved in. And since then, you have returned, you have come to campus last year, just 1 week before the pandemic started and everything was closed in the UK. And now we are very, very pleased and delighted to welcome you again virtually to share your insights and encourage our students to maybe consider thinking about working and developing their careers in organizations similar to NATO PA. So very briefly, David, if you allow me, I would like to very briefly explain who you are and give you a tiny introduction. So David Hobbs is currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Atlantic Treaty Association of the UK and the chair of the ATA Advisory Group. David was the Secretary General of NATO Parliamentary Assembly, or NATO PA for short, from January 2008 until the expiry of his mandate at the end of December in 2019. I know David doesn't want an easy retirement, and that's why he has been involved in many areas, and he is a prolific writer, and he speaks at many forums and discussions, and he will be hopefully talking about his involvement in ATA and the range of talks that he's organizing, so you can attend this as a student. As Secretary General of the NATO PA, he had overall responsibility for advising the Assembly's political leadership, an extensive program of policy research, and up to 40 activities a year for the Assembly's 60-member and non-member delegations consisting of over 400 parliamentarians. The time when I met David, he was telling me how much he enjoyed his stay in Bratislava, because Bratislava was holding some of the events which he attended. And before I hand over to David, I also wanted to explain that this session is part of the Global Careers Week events. We are running a series of events to encourage students to think about careers overseas, so we can see what else we have planned this week. And there are also some great events happening next week. So if you want to take part in these events, please do visit my career on a regular basis. Book yourself on these events. You're going to learn a lot and you will find something new. And now I would like to hand over to you, David, and I'm going to upload the lovely slides with some of the pictures that you thought will be nice to flag up at the beginning of the meeting. Just to really showcase that your job wasn't only when you were doing the Secretary General, spending meetings and writing research papers and influence and lobby, but also you got out and about a lot, didn't you?
Indeed, I did. Shall I start? And shall I take over the presentation and flip those through?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it, David. And thank you again.
Okay, I'll share my screen. There you go. Okay, well, I think that was probably the best part of the presentation. Let me see if I can get this. We should have rehearsed this before, of course. But if I can share.
So you should see, David, the pictures on the screen that you send over to me. Oh,
are you seeing that now?
Great.
What are you seeing now?
We can see it. Thank you.
Are you seeing different photos going by now?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Okay. Well, This is much better because you're not looking at me, and so I'm much more comfortable as well. I'm going to start. Every presentation is supposed to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And after discussing this with Jan, mine is definitely going to have a beginning and a middle and an end. But I'm going to start with the end. Last year, when I performed live, in those days when we still could, we put up a slideshow briefly just to keep people entertained while we were setting things up. I'll show you some pictures, which if you give a flavour for the type of things that I did in my job when I got out of the office. And then I'll go to the middle of the presentation, which is what I actually sort of did on a sort of day-to-day basis and how it fitted in to the NATO framework. And then we'll do the beginning, which is how you get in to an organisation such as the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and what sort of things you should think about if and when you choose to apply. But one of the interesting aspects of the job, one of the many interesting aspects of the job, is that you got to go to some great, fascinating meetings. And as a political junkie, you get a real buzz when you're seeing sort of NATO's leaders in a summit and all this sort of stuff. And even though at the summits, my role, I emphasize, was absolutely minute, but you can see me there, sort of eminence at the back. Here in a political game of where's the Wally, if you like, then I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you'll see President Obama there in the front row. And there I am, third row back, by the way, shortly before leaving the summit. But obviously a huge amount of the job entailed meetings, so many meetings, and it's part of the job, a very important part of the job, although equally important, by the way, the corridors and the coffee breaks. But just to give a flavor, so much of my time was spent in different meetings, different natures, from the very large events, assembly sessions, to rather smaller ones, bilaterals and small multilaterals in various national parliaments with various people. This just gives you the sort of flavour. I'll talk about how many I did, or how many the Assembly did in the course of a year and how it does them. All over the place, different meetings, huge part of the job. And yeah, it's fun in a sense, but it is actually also quite demanding. And often you do go to certain meetings in wonderful places and pretty much see the meeting room, the hotel and the airport. So you can say you've been to a place, but you haven't really. Then there are others. The other thing you do is you get to meet interesting people. And so there are a couple that you will recognise, and then there are many more who Jan will recognise, I'm certain, because he's more of my generation and also coming from where he does, some of the figures he'll know. But you get to meet very interesting people. This is a real collection of different sort of presidents, secretaries general, supreme allied commanders and all this sort of stuff. Different, well, yeah, I don't know who you recognise and who not, but we could play that game at the end. Yeah, a couple of presidents of Turkey there, former President Abdullah Gül, current President Erdogan, former Vice President of the US Mike Pence, former Speaker of the US President Duda, and if you remember the end of the Cold War, which I assume most of you don't, President wasn't then, but Vytautas Landsbergis, who was an incredibly high-profile figure, very valiant figure, following the breakup of the Soviet Union when he was fighting for Lithuania's independence, a real historic figure. Other people, Nancy Pelosi, different former president of Ukraine, Georgia, tragically, Boris Nemtsov, who I always felt would be a wonderful prime minister of Russia, and then he was assassinated. She was then prime minister of Norway, Montenegro. These are slightly anomalous, but I know that one of them is Jan's favourites, Vitaly Klitschko, who is now the mayor of Kiev. And these are two photos where you must never judge a book by its cover. Klitschko, a former heavyweight champion boxer, staggeringly eloquent man when it comes to talking about his upbringing and international politics. Almost the definition of a gentle giant. I think I'm about 6 foot. He's about 6'7". Now, this one looks definitely anomalous, but actually, Ruslana, I don't know if you've heard of Ruslana, winner of the Eurovision Song Contest in 2004 is how most people know her, but actually she became vice chairperson of the Ukrainian Parliament's Committee on Euro-Atlantic Integration. And again, formidable intellect. She's a classical pianist, a qualified conductor, and again, tremendously articulate advocate for her country, its independence, and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, some interesting ones there. Of course, NATO's Secretaries General, former High Representative for EU policy, who, by the way, used to be a member of our Italian delegation, Federica Mogherini. Interesting places, not just interesting people. North Korean border, stealth bomber. This gentleman, delightful American congressman, former congressman, sufficient seniority to get his own private jet when we had to travel, which was an experience and a half. Red carpet treatment occasionally. Exactly the opposite. Syrian refugee camp on the Turkish border. Different checkpoints. This was South Ossetia, just after the Russian invasion. This was actually the same place several years earlier when I was actually able to go into South Ossetia. UN flight into Abkhazia, another break-off region from Georgia, was subsequently occupied by Russia. Different bits of the Arctic. These are Greenland. Moscow, I'm sure you'll recognize. Yes, welcome to Kabul. Lots of trips to Afghanistan. That certainly keeps you awake. Different parts in the Arctic, Iceland, Svalbard, back in Afghanistan, Orange Revolution, Ukrainian elections back in 2004, astonishing sort of set of circumstances, and then Maidan Revolution 2014. So you can see, just a selection, interesting stuff, interesting places, and lots of different anecdotes. Now, with any luck, just confirm for me, Jan, are we getting that? My new presentation?
So we can still see the old slides with the pictures.
Just talk amongst yourselves for a while.
So I can see you trying to minimize it, David.
Yeah. Wait a minute. I'm going to go back to the shared. I've lost the shared menu.
Maybe you can try to reshare this. Yeah. And in the meantime, I'm going to try to encourage students, everybody who is joining us today, to think about some questions. There will be plenty of time for David to answer your questions. So do feel free to write them as we go along. If something comes to your mind, there's nothing like stupid question or silly question. Please ask anything you want to know, especially focus on the career side, career perspective. David told me when he came to visit us, and we took him for a quick lunch before the session last March, that when he was a young man, he always saw the advice from Career Center at the University of Leeds. And he once even went to see a career advisor here at the University of Leeds. So it really is amazing opportunity today to find out from David himself about his career journey and find about what is it like to work for these organizations, what is the first step you want to take, you need to take. Alternatively, at the end of the session, if you feel particularly brave today, you can enable your mic and camera, give us a wave at the end, and you can also ask questions verbally. But over to you, David. I can see the presentation is now on and visible.
Great. That's okay. So to the middle of my presentation, I'll talk about becoming the Secretary General of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. But in order to put that in context, I will do a very short presentation on what is NATO, because I'm very conscious that not everybody lives and breathes international security issues, and there are many misconceptions about NATO, but I will just try and put it in context, and I will resist the temptation to talk about the current issues that NATO is facing, but just talk about the specific role and how the Assembly fitted in with that and what happened. I'll talk a little bit about working there, how to get into organizations such as that, and then Jan also asked me if I could at least list what I thought was some of the major challenges that I faced during my tenure as Secretary General. I mean, this is sort of kind of wonderful being asked to talk about yourself. So let's start with a short guide to NATO. Really short guide. Forget the small print there. I'm just going to talk about the essentials. It was founded in 1949. It was a very different world. And, just after the Second World War, basically everybody wanted to go home, but it turned out the Soviets kept their forces in place. And so everybody else got very, very worried about that for obvious reasons, especially after events in Berlin. And so 12 nations in North America and Western Europe created a collective defense organization, NATO, so that they would defend one another in the event of another conflict. Membership progressively increased so that now there are 30 members of NATO, and I'm really skipping vast amounts of history here. It's very difficult to digest where they all are. It's obviously Europe, North America. If you see it on the map, then that gives you a better indication. The blue territories are NATO member countries. But NATO does indeed in many ways extend beyond that, not in terms of membership, but in terms of partnerships and the countries and organizations it works with. I'm not going to go into the different mechanisms for cooperation, but as you can see, it has cooperative relationships, or at least partnerships or relationships, dialogue relationships with everywhere from Vancouver to Vladivostok, of course, the whole Euro-Atlantic thing, Mediterranean. The Istanbul Cooperation Initiative is many states in the Gulf. There are global partners. Those are countries which have expressed an interest in working with the alliance on different sort of bases. And there are institutional partnerships, notably, of course, the United Nations, the EU, but many others as well. But what does it actually entail? Well, I'll just talk about the NATO principles. And the one that everybody should know about is collective defense. And the whole point about collective defense, and it's people talk about Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. It's the central core commitment. If you join NATO, if you are attacked, if there's an armed attack against your territory within the NATO area, all the NATO countries agree that they will treat that as though they themselves have been attacked. So it's an extremely important sort of security guarantee, because anybody who is thinking of launching an attack against one NATO country has to bear in mind that that will bring in all the other NATO countries at the same time, which is immensely reassuring. The other side of the coin, of course, is it's also an extremely important obligation, because if somebody is facing aggression, then if you're a member of NATO, you are obliged then to assist if they're attacked. It works both ways. So, of course, that you're very careful about who becomes a NATO member. And it's not on that basis, never has been, just a security organization. It's a sort of community. I rather like my graphics there, the idea of collective defense. But let's not try and guess who's supposed to be buffaloes and who's supposed to be lions. The important point about who can be a member, you have to be in the right place. So it says it's open to other qualified European or countries, because the North American ones are both in. But they're united by common principles written into the treaty, in the preamble, and also there are some references in Article 2. But if you want to be in NATO, you have to respect the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. You can talk about sort of how standards lapse from time to time and this sort of thing, but nobody's, if you like, been certified, certainly recently, of failing the test as measured by other people. But those principles are crucial. The other thing that's important to know, and for students of international organizations, it's not a supranational organization. NATO is an alliance of sovereign states which operates by consensus. So that means that if NATO decides to do something, well, what that means is it's not the Secretary General and some bunch of people, unelected people at NATO headquarters who make the decision. It's the representatives of the sovereign states who all have to agree. And it's consensus. I mean, I suppose you could put it the other way. Nobody has to disagree. And that's why sometimes it can take an awfully long time to arrive at a position. But it is the national members of NATO that call the shots. NATO is nation driven. It's not the other way around. Nowadays, many people are more familiar with the working methods of the EU, which is indeed a supranational organization. But there's some quite profound differences in the way that those organizations function. So what does it do? Well, it's not just about defense. NATO, you can often think of it, I think of it sometimes, people talk about a police force, which is completely the wrong analogy. Think of it more, if you like, as a fire brigade, if you like. And any fire brigade's most important job is actually fire prevention. The last thing you want to do is put fires out. You want to stop them lighting in the first place. So NATO does collective defense primarily in the hope that that's a deterrent. You don't need to use it because it's an effective defense. It won't be challenged. Crisis management is that you can intervene perhaps to avoid a crisis by providing the resources or a partnership to help out, prevent a crisis, and also to work with countries so that they can build their own security apparatus and institutions, and indeed democratic control of their institutions. So there's a lot to it. The collective defense roles, and you really only have to watch the news to see what's going on, but NATO has to be able to defend NATO territory, and it has to be able to defend them from any direction. That's air, sea and land. That means there's a completely integrated air and missile defense system for the NATO area. And of course, it also now has to operate in space and in cyberspace. It provides reassurance. As you know, there are all sorts of tensions on the borders. And so there are British troops deployed to the Baltic states to provide a deterrent effect there because people got nervous after Russia occupied parts of Ukraine. It's active providing air policing around and about different member countries that don't have their own air forces. Good division of labour. But it also does crisis management. It's supporting peace operations in Kosovo. NATO leads there. There's a training mission in Iraq. There are patrols in the Mediterranean Sea, providing security there and also preventing arms trafficking. Provides a great deal of logistic support for the African Union, air policing I've mentioned. Does a great deal on resilience, civil emergency planning, disaster relief, which it does all over the place. It coordinates a huge amount of disaster relief, and indeed has been very active in coordinating lots of relief during the pandemic, creating mobile hospitals, emergency hospital beds, moving medical facilities, and all those things. So I'm not going to go into the whole stuff. And again, it operates with all these different partnerships. Seminal events have led to NATO adapting to new roles. So, of course, in the Cold War, it was very much defense and deterrence. After the end of the Cold War, it became much more partnership and helping many of the former Warsaw Pact countries develop as democracies and indeed then become NATO members. Then peace support, particularly when Yugoslavia broke up dreadfully. The UN initially was the force which was trying to bring peace in the Balkans, but then asked NATO to take over, which is actually when it started to become effective. Then, of course, the dreadful attacks in 9/11, the only time when NATO invoked Article 5, the Collective Defence Clause. Everybody thought that Article 5 would be invoked because there'd most likely be an attack against a European member. It turned out that it was an attack against the United States. And that was the only time so far that Article 5 has been invoked. And then the UN invited NATO to take over the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan in 2003. So that's, okay, NATO. So what on earth is the NATO Parliamentary Assembly? Well, NATO is an intergovernmental organization, as I've said, and several years after it was founded, if people had had today's political vocabulary, they would have said there's a democratic deficit for NATO. Where's the parliamentary dimension? And NATO parliamentarians themselves, members of national parliaments, felt that there ought to be some form of parliamentary body associated with NATO. And everybody agreed with that, although they didn't agree on the precise role it would play. But an organization was created in 1955, when that marks, if you like, the first meeting of what became the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. It went through a couple of name iterations until 1999, when it became the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. The idea was, if you think about it, in many NATO countries, and not just NATO countries, if a nation's armed forces are needed in an operation, then parliaments have to often approve it, either a committee in the parliament or the full parliament. There has to be a vote. Also, some countries' parliaments can impose restrictions on what those forces might do. And so it's very important to engage parliamentarians so that they know what NATO is doing. And so that link, that feedback link that goes both ways between NATO and NATO parliamentarians, it provides sort of one-stop shopping, if you like, for NATO to get the message out to parliamentarians. And it also means NATO is aware of national parliamentary concerns. Vitally important is the connection with the transatlantic legislatures, because it's all national parliamentarians, and the Canadian Parliament and the US Congress are extremely active within the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And that, if you like, enhances the overall transatlantic relationship, that particular dialogue. It helps with the oversight of defence and security. Parliamentarians are connected to publics, and so they, if you like, are force multipliers for NATO's public outreach efforts to explain the roles and missions of the alliance and why it's important, and promoting the aims of the alliance and helping with partnerships. As you saw from those different places that I visited, there are many misperceptions about NATO, not just within NATO countries, but even more so outside the NATO area. And by having NATO Parliamentary Assembly members visit, for example, legislators in different non-member countries, that gives them a flavour for what the alliance is about, and also that it's the democratic credentials that are so important. This just shows you the different membership. If your country is a member of NATO, your parliament is a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and nobody gets fewer than 3 representatives, and it clicks all the way up so that the UK, for example, can have 18 and the United States have 36. It's loosely based on population, but actually it favours the smaller countries somewhat. Partnerships, very similar but not identical to NATO partnerships. I haven't even titled them, but you can see again, Euro-Atlantic partnerships, rather less in Central Asia than NATO has. European Parliament, some in the Middle East and North Africa, other parliamentary assemblies, and also globally, quite a lot. So when the NATO Parliamentary Assembly organises a full session, as Jan pointed out, that can involve 60 or so delegations from all over the world, and it's a complex exercise with, you know, perhaps 4 simultaneous meetings taking place in different languages, each with interpretation into many languages, and breaking up into different committees. Everybody loves talking about their wiring diagrams in an organization, and this relates to what, and this is one group and this is another group. Don't worry about it unless you're actually going to work there. There are many different committees, subcommittees, groups dealing with different partnerships. members of Parliament who are assigned to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly join various of these groups, and throughout the year will participate in many of these meetings which the Assembly organises centrally all over the place. A little bit about its current priorities. Interestingly, now a big emphasis is being placed on the need to promote our democratic foundations. We're increasingly seeing ourselves challenged by disinformation campaigns. It's not the time to talk about it, but there are some very substantial challenges, and there's a very important weapon in the arsenal for dealing with those challenges, parliamentarians, to actually defend our democratic principles and institutions, which are increasingly, if you like, on the front line, without knowing it sometimes. NATO is currently undertaking a new round of adaptation. It operates according to something called its strategic concept, which was last revised in 2010. It didn't even have one reference to China. Well, clearly that's got to change, but that's complicated because, you know, China is a long way outside the NATO area, and the challenge isn't directly military for the NATO members, or most of them. So there's some interesting stuff going on there. The reviving transatlantic cohesion. Well, you don't have to be too much of an expert to realize that there was a rough patch recently, and that's being sorted out. And of course, constantly strengthening deterrence and defense. As Secretary General, what you've got to do, I sometimes used to describe it as chief cat herd. Members of Parliament are members of Parliament. And of course, they each want to be dealing with the most important subjects of the day. But they have to respect which body they're within. And so if something really important and groundbreaking happens, you know, such as the end of the Cold War, then, you know, not every single committee and every single subcommittee can actually look at that necessarily, because that doesn't mean other things that were important the day before have ceased to be important. So you have to draw up a substantive agenda which is coherent, which takes advantage of a very substantial written output, because all these different bodies can generate reports, and a huge program of activities, say 35, maybe even 40 activities in any given year, ranging from full sessions where it can be 800 participants overall, down to small meetings where it'll just be the Secretary General and the President that go on a visit somewhere. And making that into a coherent program is obviously quite a challenge, because you've got to advise on what it should look like and persuade, if you like, the parliamentarians of its coherence, and then adapt it, because at the end of the day, by the way, they do call the shots. And so no matter what you advise, at the end of the day, they decide. So that's one very challenging part of it sometimes. What you're managing on a day-to-day basis is an international secretariat, which is actually quite small. For the large meetings, it borrows staff from NATO itself, for example, NATO interpreters, lots of freelance interpreters, but also staff from member parliaments, notably the UK Parliament and the French Parliament, the Assemblée Nationale mainly, and Senate as well. So that when you're having the big meetings, you've got the support necessary. So the staff can actually go up to 90 or 100 when you're actually organising a very big event. And in terms of now getting to the beginning of my presentation, if you look roughly at the organisation chart, how people fit in, then the research assistants, which I'll talk about, it's quite a well-trodden path. Although I didn't follow it, I came in, I joined the organisation as the director of the Science and Technology Committee. But more often than not, committee directors and indeed some of the key organisers have come in through the research assistant programme. And indeed, two of those former research assistants have now been elevated. So one is Deputy Secretary General and one is Secretary General. quite a gap, by the way, between it doesn't, you don't make that leap instantly, but it's very impressive to see. And by the way, it's a great way of doing it, because when you're interviewing candidates, I mean, these guys in the research system program, you've worked with them for 6 months at a time, so they're very much known quantities. So I've really just talked very briefly about my career there. I was actually working as an academic at the University of Aberdeen, a researcher there in what was then the Centre for Defence Studies. And I'd done a short stretch in the private sector and in the civil service. Was really happy as an academic, but we were on short-term funding, so I had to look elsewhere. And my boss put me forward for this job he'd heard of, at this NATO Parliamentary Assembly thing, and I ended up getting it and moved to Brussels for what I thought would be 3 years. I was out by a factor of 10, so my long-term planning was never very good, because as it just worked out, vacancies arose, things changed, so that the Cold War organization I joined was changed utterly with the end of the Cold War. And then new opportunities arose when I was invited to become Deputy Secretary General and then elected as Secretary General. I don't know about skills and competencies, just do the damn job. But let's get to the bit that you're probably most interested in. Getting into these organizations. You may now pick up your pens, although I'm sure Jan can give you copies if you're not doing screenshots. Firstly, you've probably the more diligent international relations students among you will have come across some of these organizations. But you tend not to hear of some of these very, very worthy organizations that don't get the profile. And I would, in some ways, particularly members of Parliament talk about them, saying, where are the headlines? Well, in a sense, they're almost like offices and universities. They're vital, but you don't make headlines. And if you do make a headline, it's usually because something's gone dreadfully wrong. But there are many organizations out there that are fascinating and very worthy places to work. NATO is one, of course. They do an internship program, which, by the way, owed a lot to the one that the NATO Parliamentary Assembly set up. The Council of Europe, often confused with the European Union, particularly because of the legal dimensions of that. The UK remains a member of the Council of Europe. And of course, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. There are research assistant programs there. There are job vacancies there. They do a huge amount on rule of law and democracy building, democracy credentials. They've had some very important challenges and some real controversies because at the end of the Cold War, of course, everybody opened their doors and gave everyone the benefit of the doubt, assuming that everyone would follow this trajectory towards the Western European liberal democracy model. And some did better than others. But fascinating place to work and visit. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was a vehicle that was called something else, the CSCE, during the Cold War, but was reinvented and redesignated at the end of the Cold War, and is an organization that brings together all the countries in the Euro-Atlantic area, Russia, United States, Europe, the Vatican, everybody's sort of in that one. That really is the Vancouver to Vladivostok. They too have a parliamentary assembly, intern programs. OECD, that's very much on the economic side. The Commonwealth Secretariat, also for Brits and Commonwealth citizens, is interesting. EU, of course, runs a very, very good internship program. I'm sure there'll be many people here from the EU. And of course, what you don't think about necessarily, many of you, I'm sure, will be thinking of applying to the UK civil service. The process is the same, and indeed, it's the successful candidates' names are all circulated to the UK Parliament. And I can tell you from my experience, the people working in the UK Parliament, firstly, it's a fascinating job. And they also do lots of international work in terms of democracy building. They support the committees which do everything, and they get invited to support the international assemblies that the UK is a member of. And so you're not just going to be stuck in Westminster if you join the UK Parliament, and indeed it's very, very varied. And of course there's the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, which is a natural vehicle if you're a little bit more into yourself than you would be for the Parliament. Oh, damn, we're being recorded. That's my civil service career ended before it started. How do you get in? Some of this is going to seem incredibly basic, and it isn't. It's astonishing. Well, firstly, it's a nightmare getting a job in many cases. Let's be realistic. It's a competition, and there's huge competition to get any particular slot. So even for a research assistant position, where you've got 5 or 6 openings, or maybe 10 a year, you'll probably have 100 or even 200 applicants, and they're all qualified. So if somebody's sort of messed up their application, it doesn't get any further than that. It's a bureaucratic check. They haven't got the application letter right, or they haven't filled in the form right. They haven't provided the right number of references. There isn't a writing sample. And they're not going to chase you. If you can't read the instructions and follow the instructions, you're probably not right for the job, is going to be the logic. Now, we all make slips, God knows, but get it right when you apply. Meet the deadlines, send off the right stuff, get somebody else to check it. And, presentation matters, accuracy matters. You're going to be, one CV, one application package among many. It's got to be legible. It's got to be clear. It's got to, you can't say one of my assets and abilities is writing. And then, frankly, hate to say it, but, the guy from Germany's got better English than the mother tongue English speaker. It ain't going to work. So take care, get somebody else to read it would be my advice, but not somebody who's going to apply for the same job. Don't give them too many ideas, and distinguish yourself in your application if it's not too late. Everybody's application, let's face it, you're going to come up with a great degree. You're going to go, you've got great references, otherwise you've picked the wrong person to do a reference for you. By the way, everybody goes to the seminar, so yeah, that's all there. Take that as a given. But what makes you stand out? What else have you done? Are you a member of the relevant university society that's done stuff that's related to the job that you're applying for? Have you contributed some writing to this, or is there a hobby that's particularly relevant? You need to have more than the basic stuff on your CV, if you can. And of course, you can't invent it. That's the other thing. Make sure that what you put down is true, because if you do get to the interview and they're doing their job right, they'll find out. So don't leave big gaps unexplained either. I didn't put that up there, but it's good if there's a gap, explain why there's a gap. And actually, if you're doing something in the gap, don't worry about it. If you're doing something, willingness to work, I did some jobs which I didn't think were relevant to what I ended up doing, but I didn't leave a gap on my CV. So yeah, that sort of admin job I got in Jacob Kramer Art College, which I think now has been taken over by Metropolitan University, it's worth it. And by the way, it turned out to be more relevant than I thought, some of the work I did there. Oh dear, I've gone on for far too long. Challenges and how I overcame them. There were innumerable challenges over the years. I was there for a long time. As I said, you have to plan the Assembly's work in advance, but you also have to bear in mind that if something really important happens, you need to adapt. And so you've got to have the means of reacting quickly, perhaps with a smaller meeting, a smaller ad hoc meeting, and then you can bring the other stuff to bear more slowly. But that can take you by surprise, and big changes, which not necessarily sort of, if you like, paradigm changes, but nevertheless very important, such as the occupation of Crimea and the conflict in Ukraine. I don't know if many of you won't remember the Second Gulf War, which was a problem for many countries because the Allies themselves, it was not a NATO issue, but some people thought it should, and so there were some tensions within the alliance on that. Breaking down Cold War stereotypes, unbelievable how many people, the Cold War stereotypes live on. You can put a stake through their heart, bury them at the crossroads, and of course, to some extent, they're coming back. So, Afghanistan, interestingly, the challenge that you face when you go to Afghanistan, everybody who joined the NATO Parliamentary Assembly did not join up to go into a combat zone. We joined a bureaucracy, for God's sake. And so Afghanistan comes along, and actually, in all fairness, most colleagues were very enthusiastic to go and see what was going on there. But you have to bear in mind that, you're sending people into harm's way. Now, actually, you can only send people where NATO's insurance will cover you, so that gets you out of some places, but it covers Afghanistan, even when things were quite hot. And I can tell you, when I became Secretary General, I had not at that point been on one of the visits that we'd organised to Afghanistan. And I nevertheless had to authorise one, and by chance met the father of a colleague who was going. And the colleague was very keen to go. His dad wasn't very keen to see him go. And you have to make sure, and I actually told colleagues privately, every single one that went, if you or your family is unhappy about this, there are no adverse consequences for not going. Absolutely nothing will happen, and the decision will be kept quiet. For administrative reasons, I've made a different decision that somebody else is going, so that there would never be anything attached to their not wanting to go or coming under family pressure not to go. The headquarters got bombed. It caught fire. There were terrorist attacks in Brussels. Dismissals are always horrible. Dealing with inappropriate behaviour, staggering sometimes, and also maximising staff empowerment, because frankly, you get best value from people by devolving as much as you possibly can to let people run their own professional life. This is the task. Ask if you need guidance or clarification, but do it however you like, as long as it gets done. And actually, what you find is that the power you give to people to do that, you wish if only they do that to the people working for them. But you nevertheless have to respect the chain of command, and so you don't want somebody coming back or actually circumventing the chain of command. It's always a bad idea. Look, Jan, let me stop there. Thanks for everyone's attention. I'm sorry you said 10 minutes at the end, and I thought I'd get through quicker. But as there is now a collective sigh of relief, I will stop my presentation.
Amazing, David. Thank you so much for your insightful talk. It's always great to listen to you. I know this is the third time I listen to this particular presentation, and I always learn something new, and it's just great to hear from such a high-profile person as you, who is very approachable, clearly has lots to say, and is very keen to encourage young people, not just from University of Leeds, to think about careers and follow maybe similar path to yours. And I particularly enjoy the suggestions where you talk about the range of organizations that people may be keen to get involved in, and some of them may not be on the horizon. So I hope students will be doing research by combining the name of the organization and internship or graduate opportunity or research opportunity. But that history of yours is just amazing. And I always like to reflect how some of the career does happen, how sometimes we are not planning for something.
Yeah.
Like you said, I thought I will be in Aberdeen, academic for the rest of my life, researcher, become a professor, and suddenly there a stop to it for a range of external reasons. And there was another opportunity that completely shifted your career into different direction. And now you are the expert who is being consulted on a range of things related to NATO, parliamentary assemblies, defense. So it's always good to have that mindset where you are able to accept a range of opportunities that will come across your life. And I always like to talk to students about the movie I like watching. It's a comedy with Jim Carrey. It's called The Yes Man. And this person who is very grumpy, you have to watch it, David. It's a very grumpy person. His life is going nowhere. And he comes across this guru, and this guru tells the person, okay, you have to say yes to life's opportunities. And ultimately, he says yes to all of the crazy things that his friends ask him. But his life changes. He's got a girlfriend. He learns Korean language. And his life is so full of great opportunities. So if students will only take one thing from this talk, it's definitely to be more open to a range of areas that life can offer, but also proactively seek these opportunities. No, it's about researching what can I do with my degree, what can I do at the university. So, David, you'll be very pleased. We are having an avalanche of questions coming in.
Okay.
And one of them is from our lovely PhD research student called Marine, who actually commented that she did spend some time at the Interparliamentary Union, IPU, as a research assistant. So we have someone who's already has a little bit of experience in the Parliamentary Assembly, which is great. And Marine is asking, and maybe I want to expand on this question, but what Marine is asking is if there are any general requirements or criteria to be eligible to apply for a role in NATO or NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And we are looking at one side, and there will be the academic qualifications. Is undergraduate degree enough, or do people need postgraduate third degree or research degree? The other side is the languages, but also in terms of skills and competencies, what would you say are the top 3 competencies that organizations like NATO parliamentary assemblies are looking the candidates to have?
That's an awful lot to go at. In terms of qualifications, it's tragic. NATO Parliamentary Assembly specifies that you need a postgraduate degree, so a master's, and you can apply when you're when the master's is expected. In reality, and historically, there have been cases where, particularly some time ago, when before we upped, if you like, the entry requirement, there are a good graduate can do the job if you get the right one. And also they need to be open-minded and flexible, because what we ask those researchers to do, they come in because, for example, they've done perhaps international relations, and they've focused on one particular area, but actually the Economics and Security Committee needs somebody to look at something which is a bit new to the research staff. And so you need to be able to turn your hand to a subject which you haven't necessarily dealt with before. Now you're guided through that and mentored through that. And actually, you have to look at it as also an advantage, because what your job is to assist in the drafting of a report, which is for parliamentarians. You're not producing necessarily original research. What you're doing is saying, look, this is the state of the art. This is what's known about this particular topic. These are the policy issues, and these are the decisions and issues that decision makers are facing. And so going in as somebody who is experienced in digesting this information and then regurgitating it in a usable form, it's almost an advantage to go in not having known much about it. If you're talking to, somebody, the professor of astrophysics about black holes, you possibly won't understand a word. If, however, somebody sort of will go away and read his work and present it to you as a non-physicist, you probably get most of it. You say, well, what decision does he want me to make? Well, he wants you to build this really expensive telescope, and this is why. So you need to be flexible. Willingness to work. Actually, willingness to work. Open-mindedness and flexibility, and And also, one of the challenges that happens, and it's not just, particularly if you're going to do a job where you're writing, don't put your ego in it. It's funny, most of you have gone through your academic lives and you've done really well. You've always got A's and B's, and there might have been, you've got odd comment here. You could have done a bit more there. You could have done a bit more there. Well, actually, if you're writing for publication, someone is going to say, that needs to be changed. It's not that clear. And you need to go back and redo it. And actually, the best writer on earth needs an editor. And actually, look at it. They're helping you with your product. So if you can, it's great practice to work with an editor and take it on the chin when somebody criticizes it, because it's not meant to be critical. It's meant to be creative and constructive. All the different organizations have different requirements in terms of academic qualifications and nationality. So, for example, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly actually will take researchers from many different nationalities. However, it's obliged in terms of full-term employment to take citizens of NATO countries. They can actually be citizens of, they can hold dual nationality, and the other nationality doesn't need to be a NATO country, but they have to be a NATO citizen. And I suppose that will apply to differing degrees in different other organizations. IPU, as Maureen will have noticed, is actually, I think, almost every single country on earth is represented. It's basically the UN. Let's try another one. And I'll try to be quicker.
That's great, David. Thank you. We have 1 minute to 4, but I know David said at the beginning that he's quite happy to answer some additional questions in some additional add-on time, extra time. So apologies if you ask a question and we are not going to select it. There is a question from Caroline, and I know you answered it partially. So she's asking, in the beginning of your career journey, where did you start? What did you do to develop your career? What was your first job, David? What did you do as a first job after you finish uni? Was it a job in Aberdeen Uni, or was it something else as a sort of bridge?
When I graduated, I didn't know what to do. And so I hadn't done very much travel, so I decided I hadn't done a gap year. I decided to take a year out, and I ended up waiting tables in Paris, and realized after about 6 months of abject poverty that if I didn't do something about getting back into the jobs market, I was going to be a waiter in Paris possibly for the rest of my days. And so, sadly, because I have to say it was great fun. I mean, there were times when I didn't have enough money in my pocket to get home. It was a very different world then. I came back, and this is when I started going into the Leeds University Career Centre, because you could do that. I still was I think I still had my students' union card, and they were very flexible about that. And so I was doing all sorts of research, and I thought, well, one of the things I'd done, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on cruise missile technology. Never mind how, but that made me realize that I was quite interested in this interface between technology and policy. And so I applied for master's programs that were relevant. And so I accepted the one that actually came with funding. And so I ended up doing the master's at King's College in London. In war studies, which I loved, and it was tough because I'd stopped doing history on the British education system. I kind of stopped history at school at 14, and so a third of this course was, if you like, history of conflict. So it was tough, some of it, but loved it. And then I applied for civil service. It was tough to get in then, because there was in those days there were impediments on hiring and all this sort of stuff. And I ticked all the boxes that you'd expect, Foreign Office, Defence. I can't remember what all the ones that you'd expect to be interested in. And I ended up in Her Majesty's Customs and Excise. And actually, which turned out to be, thank God, a lot more interesting than I expected, but it clearly wasn't going to be a career for me. And so I decided I'd give it a year. and then do something else. And so I did. I gave it a year. And as I said, it turned out, again, in later life, I did learn stuff that came in useful, much more useful than I expected. And then my brother was setting himself up in business. So I felt strongly enough about it to sort of, if you like, sacrifice a steady salary and help my brother for a few months while I applied for academic jobs. Got into the Centre for Defence Studies at Aberdeen, and I loved the job, and I also loved Aberdeen. And so, like I say, I really expected to stay there, but it was funded by the Ford Foundation, and there was no guarantee it was going to be renewed. It turned out that it was, but several of us on the programme that were funded by that actually got out before it came through, leaving my then boss to finish off the work. But that was the key points, if you like, that got me there. No real plan.
That's really, really useful. And it's funny what you said about the bar work, because people often underestimate and undersell when they work in hospitality or behind the bar. And they always apply for roles where they feel like they only need to list the relevant work experience. But so many skills and competencies you can develop when you are working behind the bar as a waiter, as a chef. So it's definitely worth reflecting, flagging up what you have learned in this area. You became a more people's person, you became better at creating rapport with customers, more organized. And look, it can nicely lead into a range of areas that can be completely unrelated, no?
Well, in my case, it also helped because, of course, it helped with the language. And I didn't really get around to answering that question, but often you will find, we found in recruiting at the Assembly, you have to be able to work in one of the official languages. Although within the office, overwhelmingly it's English. But you do, and there is actually a requirement which you must fulfill to learn the other official language. So if you're coming in and you're a native mother tongue English speaker, then you are obliged to do a specific course in French and get qualified. Because when you're looking to get these jobs filled, particularly the committee directors positions, you can find the people with the right background, for example, to run your defence and committee, but you can't always find them with the language skills. And so there you really have to get the commitment from them to learn the language. And actually, I have to say, everybody did. People, I was very impressed. People would come to the second language with, in some cases, relatively limited language experience, and really do well, or well enough.
Great. Do we have somebody in the audience? And I know that people may be leaving because they have other commitments after 4. Do we have somebody in the audience who would like to ask a question by enabling the mic and camera and ask David directly? If not, David, I will pick one more question. There is a question about having a PhD. Is PhD advantageous? So if people are considering, shall I go for a master degree course and finish it there, or shall I upgrade my studies and do a research degree? Is this something that is generally a positive thing when you want to work in NATO parliamentary assemblies?
That is an incredibly difficult question to answer, and I think it's changed in my day. I mean, the flippant answer, if you listen to sort of some entrepreneurs, is to say that PhDs are incredibly important. I've got 5 working for me. But the reality now, I mean, a lot of the committee directors, I think a majority of the committee directors at the Assembly now have PhDs. And I think it's become more important. I was offered the opportunity to do a PhD at King's, and I still don't know if I did the right thing by deciding against it. And so I think there is no clear answer on that. I still don't know whether I should have done one or not. And I suppose if you're intent upon pursuing an academic career, then I would say pretty much unambiguously, it's kind of it's essential these days. Elsewhere, I actually don't know. I'm a big fan of academic qualifications, but whether it's essential or not in international bodies, it's a real mixture. It's a real mixture within that framework, and also a lot will depend on the countries they come from too. So I don't know is the answer. I wish I did. I can't. I might be able to give someone individual guidance, but a blanket answer, can't do it. I see someone's there wanting to ask a question in person.
Thank you for the honest answer. Rego, go for it. What is your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. First of all, half of my question has been covered now, but the other side is do you have any colleagues or do you know any people who worked at NATO who come from a completely different background? Let's say someone is coming from engineering background or a scientific related work experience. This is my question.
Well, I'd like to think I did. Since I started out, I started out doing physics. There's also been at least one NATO Secretary General who was a physicist. Javier Solana was a physicist. People do have different backgrounds and come in different ways. But if they're doing policy, I suppose within the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which is niche, let's face it, most come in from a policy background rather than a technical background. Within NATO itself and other organizations, it does vary. I mean, I am definitely of the view that we need to have more people in the civil service and in parliament, in political leadership positions, who have scientific backgrounds. I have been horrified in some briefings to see the level of scientific understanding or lack thereof, not just of the audience sometimes, but of the political figure giving the bloody briefing. And so, yeah, we definitely need more. In fact, I would say generally, if you like, the scientific mindset, I still think is you need both overall. I mean, you need a mix of skills in a successful organization. But I would say that still in politics, in that field, underrepresentation from STEM, and I would love to see that change. And I would by the way, I think in the UK civil service, they're recognizing that that's a problem. But I can remember in my day when I looked at the Foreign Office, and they very proudly were saying, because they were accused of Oxbridge bias. And they said it's ridiculous because only half were from Oxbridge. In those days, there were 42 British universities. So my deduction from that was that clearly there were not that many of them doing maths. If they thought that having half from 2 universities somehow meant that they were not Oxbridge biased. I'm sorry, long-winded answer to a really good question, which also put me on one of my high horses.
Thank you.
Great question, Rego, and thank you for the answer, David. It somehow reminds me of a saying that I think it was General Patton who said, if everybody thinks the same, no one thinks at all. And it only takes a person with STEM degree to come in an area where everybody has got a social science degree to completely disrupt the thinking and start asking questions, and then people will start thinking, they will start justifying why they are doing it this way, that way. So it's a great question and very good answer as well.
It is. I used to tell people working for me, because the people can be intimidated, and frankly, many leaders, there's this syndrome where they shoot the messenger. Somebody comes with bad news, and so that person becomes associated with the bad news. And I took the view that if I've made a decision, I'm perfectly happy to have somebody ask me about it and even say, are you sure you're doing the right thing? Because if they're thinking that, other people will be thinking that. And so even if I stick with that decision, it's been helpful for me to go through that process and be aware that I'm going to face that when we go broader with it. Now, you have to have a corporate decision that if this is the decision as an organization, that's what we're going with. But as I mentioned, giving people, empowering people, but respecting the chain of command, absolutely vital that people do not fear coming to you and questioning. I mean, I when I first started at the Assembly as the committee director, there was a much more experienced person working for me. And I realized that whenever she said, when I made decision, "Are you sure?" that actually at that point, I should stop what I'm doing and think incredibly hard, because for her, that was code for, I think you are about to make a really big mistake. And generally speaking, she was a very, very good weather vane for that. So when she said, "Are you sure?" But I tried to encourage people to be a bit more explicit than that, so I didn't have to read the signs.
That's a great learning, and it's good to be aware of the signs when people are asking something and repeating. I have to tell that to my colleagues in my team. If I make a decision to tell me, "Are you sure, Jan?"
Yeah.
David, we have Alia who's got a hand up. Are we still okay for one last question?
I'm absolutely fine with that, sure.
Great. Alia, I think you are connecting from Beirut, Lebanon, if I remember right. Would you like to ask a question, Alia?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't turn off my camera. There's a technical issue with my camera. However, can you hear me well?
We can indeed.
Yes.
Okay, great. So basically, while doing my undergraduate degrees, I was interested in politics a lot. And for my good luck, part of my program had the 6 free electives, in which I was able to take 2 of my electives in conflict regulations and international politics and international relations, which I really enjoyed. And I told myself that one day I'm going to make use of those courses in international organizations, because I would really like to be part of a solution on a global impact, because that's what I like to do. So basically, my question is, as a graduate who have a BS in geology and masters in petroleum engineering, with this interest in political sciences and international relations, like saying that I have took 2 courses and it's on my transcript, is this a plus for my selection as a research assistant for the program at the NATO? Like, will this help me with the selection?
For me, the fact that you've done some electives in a relevant discipline shows, not just the enthusiasm and the interest and all this sort of stuff, and you've also got the scientific background. So for me, if I were looking at your application, that would be a definite plus. Now, in all these organizations, of course, I don't know what passport you hold, but you have to look at that too. But I would have said that given your background, the world is your oyster in a sense, because you're covering, if you like, both sides of the equation, the international security issues, and also, if you like, the disciplined, or if you like, more scientific mindset that I think is another asset. I'm not, like I say, I don't want to dismiss the arts. Don't get me wrong, but the combination of the two is as good as it gets.
Yeah, and if you were in my place, now this is a personal question, if you were in my place, how would you emphasize on those electives in your application?
Well, usually there's a letter. It depends where you're applying to. But usually, in addition to whatever forms there are to fill in, you can obviously state that. And the other thing, of course, would be to get the recommendations from the people that taught that. So, maybe you could even add a letter of recommendation. I don't think anybody would penalize you for adding an extra one. But the reference there would also be useful, because, my guess would be that the person writing the reference for the international security course that you did is going to give you good reference. Well, that's great. And a lot of this is, I think in any career, and I'm not going to, I shouldn't talk about my kids, but it's astonishing. If you go into most jobs, your degree is, if you like, an indication of intellectual horsepower. And in many jobs, all they want to know is if you've got the intellectual horsepower and they'll train you. You know, I mean, lots of people who degrees in, you know, I don't know how many jobs there are in Anglo-Saxon history, probably not enough to employ all the graduates, but they're going to end up working in media organizations, possibly, you know, for Google and all this sort of stuff. Organizations will train you. So don't necessarily think in terms of, you know, going directly into, you know, okay, I've done geology, I'm going to be a geologist. I think you're doing the right thing by looking elsewhere as well.
Yeah, I've done geology for one main reason, which is I wanted to surround myself with the whole understanding of the energy systems, which is the petroleum, in order to know how to solve the climate change issues properly. And that's why I did my master's. But I did those 2 electives because I wanted to put my knowledge and my skills into an international organization so that my impact could reach globally all the societies and everyone, that in which if I developed a solution for something, everyone can benefit from it.
Yeah, and indeed. So, you know, look at energy security as an issue. These days, you know, energy security and, you know, energy in society. I mean, these are, you know, I wouldn't be worrying too much about your future career.
David, but blimey, it feels like we can be here, and I'm looking outside, it's already getting dark. We can be here for the evening, not just the afternoon that we promise students. Alia, thank you so much for that question. And David, thank you so much for providing a very concrete answer. I know many students will be very inspired and motivated by your talk. And I just have to say, I'm always really honored to have you coming on campus, whether it's in person or virtually. You see this very rarely. There's such a high-profile person with so much experience, yet still willing to contribute to the education and teaching and inspiring students to follow their steps or a similar step. So,
well, that's very kind of you, Jan. It's something which I've always enjoyed. So, and I don't know about high profile and all that sort of stuff. You know, I just did my job.
I have to tell students, we don't pay you for this, okay? You are doing it because you really enjoy what you are doing. And thank you so much, David. And I just want to ask if people can turn the camera on and at least wave at David, because when we had the beginning of the session, David was afraid he will speak to just a very anonymous audience. So if you can enable your camera, everyone or those people for whom camera is working, and give David a wave, yeah. I'm sure we will see you again, David. I'm sure we will see you again soon on campus. I know you are still involved in a range of things which are really cool and exciting, and I know you are really keen to engage the young people, young population to get involved in a range of areas. So I hope everybody who is here, they will get to meet you again. Thank you so much, David, for your invaluable, insightful session. I hope you have a lovely rest of the day. I know you already had 2 coffees before the session, so please no more coffee. So you have a nice, peaceful sleep. Thank you so much to all of the students, alumni for joining. I know this is not the whole amount of people who joined originally, and I'm looking forward to see you again soon. Thank you again, David, and have a lovely rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been fun. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.